You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Armand Rosamilia and Jay Wilburn. Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. I'll be talking more about her as the month goes on. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have two fantastic authors on with me. Armand Rosamilia, who is no stranger to the show. He's been on a couple of times. And Jay Wilburn, who I have never had the pleasure of having on the show today. So I'm super excited to have Jay with us, and Armand's here also. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
This will probably be Jay's last appearance. Once you talked. Whereas I am a delight, and I'll be on several hundred more times.
He's a featured guest.
Yes.
Armand, since you've been on the show before, Jay, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Back when I was in elementary school, I was reading stuff like Tolkien and some different sci-fi stuff as well. And I started writing like crappy imitations of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then over time, started working on some of my own things and slowly connected into horror and zombies and things like that. And then eventually was writing for money and sort of found my voice as I went along that way.
What do you think it was that that helped you find your voice more than anything?
Well, actually trying to write professionally. I don't feel like when I first started that I had any idea. Again, it was mostly zombie stuff that I was writing, and was surprised to have gotten any money for it at all. And then kind of expanded out to other things again. And over time, you kind of find something that's bigger than genre. So it wasn't just that I was writing zombie stories or I was writing steampunk or whatever. It was more along the lines of I was writing my story within those genres. And so kind of got a feel for how I want to tell a story and how to communicate some of the ideas I wanted to get across.
It's kind of one of those things where you imitate your heroes or whatever else is going on in the genre until your own voice starts coming out. I think that happens with a lot of writers.
Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth too, where at the beginning I was just writing raw. I just get a story out, didn't care about sentence structure or any of that kind of stuff. And then over time, as I was writing professionally and making money, and then especially as I was writing full time, I got more proficient in the technicals of writing. And I would go back and read some of those old stories, and even though they weren't as refined as other things, there was something missing in my current writing that I had in that. So kind of looking back and forth, I sort of had to find, what did I have at the beginning that was raw and visceral, and how do I apply that and being more technically proficient too.
Yeah. What is it about horror that you love so much?
It's more the technique, I guess, than it is the genre. It was probably some Stephen King books that originally got me into horror as being something more than just, the slasher films and stuff like that. But when I started kind of seeing it as being able to tell stories using darkness, I think it appealed more, bigger highs and bigger lows, and more potential to tell, some tough topics than I think other genres provided.
Armand, we've talked a little bit about this in the past, but what initially drew you to writing horror?
Dean Koontz, definitely. My mother, I think I brought this up before on last time I was on. My mother's still a huge horror fan, paperback horrors. I mean, like 3-4 books a week. And that's what really got me into it was Dean Koontz, where I never was a big King fan. I think because she is still to this day such a big Stephen King fan. And, that really is what started me on this path. Hey, somebody can do this for a living. This is amazing. Let me try to do this.
Yeah. What separates the kind of horror that you like, Armand, from the stuff that you don't connect with? What do you think it is about Koontz that did it for you where King didn't?
I think looking back, it was, to me, even though Dean Koontz uses a lot of very big words, right. he was still a pulp fiction writer to me. And that's, I think, what appealed to me even as a kid. I might have to look up a bunch of words in every book. But, I grew up also on a lot of fantasy, Robert E. Howard and stuff like that. And I just liked that good adventure story. And even though Koontz, you could say the same thing about King. You can lump them in as horror authors, but they really aren't. They're so much more. And all of the other books that Koontz wrote, all his action thrillers and all the other things that he had to use, pen names for back in the day, all those books were just really fun, action adventure, exciting, books for me. So I think I got into it more from that, and it's not, kind of like what Jay said. It's not really that, hey, I just want to write horror books. I just want to write, a fun book, an interesting book.
Right. Well, people talk about King and Koontz as well as being horror authors, but like you said, they're really so much more. And I think when you sit down to write, genre really should be one of the last things that you think about. The characters ought to tell you what kind of story it is. The setting ought to tell you what kind of story it is. When the two of you sit down to write a story, do you think about the supernatural elements that may or may not go into it? Do you think about, the plot device that will scare some people? Do those things even, do you even worry about those things in the beginning? How about you, Jay?
It's kind of a yes and no answer in the sense that when we write together, we take turns in who sort of sets the stage. And that includes writing the first chapter, but it also includes the premise and then some character detail and stuff like that. So in some ways, the premise itself suggests the genre. But we will reach out into, like, right now we're writing something involving sci-fi, and then we wrote another one that was probably closer to, like, transgressive crime fiction. But in another sense, we're pretty loose with the stories so that they go directions that we don't expect. Like Yard Full of Bones went a lot further into cosmic horror than I think we originally thought it would when we started. But then it also has like a really interesting mystery element that I didn't expect when we started writing. So in some ways, I think we kind of borrow from all our tool bags to make a story into something good.
What about you, Armand? Does the beginning dictate what kind of story it's going to be, or does the story dictate where it's going to sit in the bookstore?
I think for me, it depends on the story. It depends on how much of it I have in my head. I'm a total pantser, but I might sit down today and start because I have a character, or I have a scene, or I have an opening sentence, or I have just that little thing, or it could be a story that I've been playing in my head for weeks and it just won't go away. And I already have a lot of that story and mood and everything else in there. I'm more worried about, is it in my voice? Is it something that I can be proud of? And I think what helps me and Jay is because we write in so many different genres. We can kind of pick and choose some of those pieces. And while Yard Full of Bones was definitely something that I had no idea we were going to get into cosmic horror. I saw it as more of a mystery when I started. That idea was mine, and it was really just that. It was let's write a mystery together, and then it became all this other stuff because the horror elements started creeping in, and the other things started creeping in, and that was the fun of it.
It opens like a mystery. You definitely set that tone in the very beginning,
right? And I think that was kind of important. You know, it still keeps that mystery feel towards it, but there's a lot of chapters where we move it around a little bit with the cosmic horror and just the regular, the basic horror stuff. And that was the fun. That was the challenge, especially when Jay, writes a chapter and kind of throws it, left of where I think it's going. And then I have to go, okay, let me recover here and let me still keep the feel of what we're doing, but knowing that we're not going, okay, let's just write, I think it would have been hard if we said, hey, let's write an H.P. Lovecraft story, and
right.
and let's do this, or hey, let's write a straight mystery, because then you have to have those tropes, you have to have all that thrown in there, and you really can't deviate too much. With the way we wrote this, we have no idea what this is. I had an idea, obviously Jay had an idea, and we just kind of ran with it.
Jay, you mentioned that when you and Armand are writing together, that dictates a different writing style and a different planning style. Armand said he's a strict pantser. When you're writing for just yourself, are you a pantser, a plotter, or some mix in between?
Mostly pantser. The one thing that I do that services us well as we're kind of making it up as we go in the books is that I keep track of things really well. So I guess you call that the story Bible or something. So I Bible pretty well. So when a new character comes up, I'll write down who they are and what they've done. And usually I'm the one that goes back and makes sure continuity stays out through there. So what we do well together, I think, is creating sort of a third voice that's not really either one of us, but blends both of us. And then being willing to just let the story go wherever. I write my chapter, and I think I know where it's going, but as soon as he writes his chapter, that's where it's going. So whatever I had in my head that I was going to take a left, that's not there anymore. I just let that go and go with what the story is. And I think that creates a better story because even the two of us are surprised by it, which I think is more likely to surprise the audience, where it doesn't follow this strict linear pattern that you can guess at the beginning.
So it sounds like there's a lot of improvisation between the two of you, and kind of like, oh, you think that's epic? Hold my beer. Watch what I do on this next chapter.
Yeah.
Armand, what's the collaboration process like for you as opposed to the standalone stuff that you do? Nope. And Armand just lost power. He just messaged and said so. Hopefully he'll be back up here in just a second. Well, Jay, when you're tackling a standalone project, and I know that you have a long-running series, if you're writing something in your series as opposed to something completely different, do you begin those projects differently?
Yeah, the series is the exception to the Pantser rule. Like, that series is already mapped out. It's going to be 12 books. And I already know what happens. The only thing that changes with those is like where does one book end and the next one begin. So, on what side of a major event. Now, while I'm writing them, I open up to the idea that like it goes in a different direction. So I have the main outline done. I know who's going to die and when and all that kind of stuff. But if the story takes a turn, I kind of let that play out so it's true to the characters and that sort of thing. In terms of other books that I write myself or short stories or that kind of thing, I usually have a general idea of where I'm going, and then I'm willing to let those things go when something else works better in the story. And then typically I'll go back and retrofit the themes that present themselves so it looks like I knew what I was doing the whole time, kind of thing.
Let's talk about your long-running series, the Dead Song Legend Dodecology. What is that? What is that story, and where did it come from?
Well, originally, again, I'd been writing mostly zombie stuff, and so I would just come up with a premise, and if I couldn't fit it anywhere, I would just kind of make it into a zombie story. And the original short story was just this weird thing where I was like, okay, what would happen if it were just like a documentary? And so literally the story is a character with no name in a sound booth reading copy for a documentary, and they're kind of skipping around and all that kind of stuff. And so the horror of it kind of sneaks up on you because it seems like he's just describing the world of zombies where music played a big part in music mashups, and these guys went around collecting the music, but then there was some kind of mystical thing that happens near the end that kind of turns the story on its head. But again, it like breaks all the rules. It's literally tell and don't show because it's a voiceover, and the characters don't have names, and all the stuff that like makes a story technically not work. And the only reason it got published was a charity anthology said we need weird zombie stories. And I was like, well, this one's weird. It doesn't even technically have zombies in it. The guy's just talking about it. So I put it in there, and it was a charity anthology. I didn't get paid or anything, and I think the press that did it is gone. But then Ellen Datlow picked that story up for Best Horror of the Year, and it was in volume 5, I think. And so that story got a huge amount of attention, and then because it was in there, another big anthology picked it up and used it in there. So that story just got legs in a way that I didn't expect. And each time it came up, I would like reread the story, trying to figure out what people saw in it. I was like, I don't understand what makes this a good story, But then I was looking to start, another novel or a series, and so I was like, well, people responded to this, so let me take that story that was described there and make the world. And I started writing it as a novel and realized there's no way I was going to finish it in a novel, so I thought a trilogy. And then I realized it was still running a little long, so I sat down and actually mapped out the entire story. And if I wanted to tell the whole thing, every aspect that was described in the short story and make it into a novel, it was going to be 12 books. So I mapped it all out, and I kind of sat down and did a gut check. Do I actually have the patience and willpower to actually do this? And I figured, well, I'll just give it a shot. So I'm up to book 5 has been published, and I'm working on book 6 now, and I've gotten some decent response to it. Kind of taken it in some different directions and fleshing out who the characters were and all that sort of thing.
I think a lot of writers would lose patience on a long series like that, and like you were worried, that you might. Does planning it all out like that ahead of time, does that keep the fear at bay and keep it kind of immediate to you? Because like some authors we all know that we won't name, commit to these long series, and then they get really bogged down in the middle, and maybe they just lose interest. Maybe it's not as fun as it was. Maybe it's just hard, and they just don't know where to take these characters. Does having a roadmap like that from the beginning help to keep that stuff in check?
I think it does. Again, it's not how I usually do things. So
right.
I don't have any other example where I've outlined to this detail. Like nothing else I've done has that worked. I used to outline short stories that detailed, but then never stuck to the outline. Like it was something completely different by the time I got to the end. I think it helps this series because it is sort of like a road trip kind of thing where they're crisscrossing the country and creating influence, and characters that are created in one point become more significant several books down the road. So like when I bring a character into the story, like I know who they are, I know where they're going, I know why they matter, and so I can lay those pieces down more succinctly, I guess, because I know where they're going. It's not like I get to book 6 and I'm like, oh man, I got to go back and retrofit that character in or something. Like they were introduced in a way that's going to make what they do in book 6 or book 8 make sense,
Right.
And so I think it helps any kind of epic series like that. I think it helps a lot. And some of the authors that you are hinting at that are very good at what they do, but they get bogged down. I think they're dealing with epic series with lots of characters, and they haven't necessarily fleshed out where all that's going. So now they're kind of tangled up in it, kind of thing.
And that's the beauty of writing standalone novels, isn't it? You don't deal with that on an epic scale like that. You've got one story with these characters. If you can land this story, you can go and tell a different story next time.
Right. And sometimes those long series become that. It was something that was supposed to be a standalone, and then was supposed to be a trilogy, and it's kind of like this add-on type thing where, how far have they painted themselves into a corner, and this is a marketable book, and now we got to do 5. What have I not done, and what can I, what piece have I tied together that I can untie for a new story, kind of thing. So I think sometimes there is a difference between the accidental series and one that's planned out.
Well, and I think that would be a real temptation. That say you've got 3 books and they did moderately well, but then you have this book that is intended as a standalone, but it just goes nuts, and people love the story, they love the characters, and this is the thing that outsells everything else. I would think that's a real temptation to try to unravel the ending and keep it going.
Well, when Armand and I were writing together, the books that we wrote are solid standalones in the sense that if like no other book came along, these would work fine by themselves. It wouldn't feel like you left a story untold. But at the same time, we always consciously leave the pieces in place so that there would be a natural sequel. That if we did pick up, it wouldn't be just trying to shoehorn those characters into another story. We leave some piece open that we can move off from, and it makes sense, if one of the books does take off. But we're always pretty conscious about giving readers like that solid, complete story that they feel satisfied that we ended it for them.
So tell me about Yard Full of Bones, this new book that you've done together. What was the initial thought for this book?
Well, at the beginning,
I know Armand said that he kind of felt like it was a mystery. What was your initial thought about the idea?
Well, each time we start, we come off with the premise, and so we kind of have we understand the starting point. We understand basically who the characters are that are coming in. We map them out a little bit, and in a couple stories we mapped out not Yard Full of Bones, but a couple stories we mapped out the characters extensively, so that we knew their backstories and stuff. And most of that didn't necessarily come in directly into the story, but it informed us in bringing the characters around. So the same was true of Yard Full of Bones. A lot of the details that come out later in the novel were sort of in place about who the characters were at the beginning, so that from the beginning to where they go makes sense because we were going from the same template of who the character was. So you kind of have the death and the resulting accusations and mystery that occurred at the beginning of the story. That was in place. And then we sort of had to put it together. Okay, so we're moving the characters forward. Where does it take them? What does that place become? And then as we get closer to the end of any story we're writing, kind of the 3-act structure, I guess, once we pass Act 2, we sort of, Armand and I will sit back down in a huddle and kind of figure out, okay, here's where we are. What's the ending? Like, where is the most logical place for this to go so that we don't just keep dragging on an unending Act 2, but we both start moving towards the end of that third act. I think his crime fiction writing, I think Armand's crime fiction writing is excellent. He calls himself a pulp writer, but like his Dirty Deeds series and some things like that, I think are...
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think they're a lot stronger. I would call them pulp in the sense of the mentality, but I think they're a lot stronger and a lot deeper than he gives himself credit for. And so when he started Yard Full of Bones, I think it had that same gusto, I guess, in the beginning. And with both of us writing a book, we did The Enemy Held Near, which is sort of a haunted house story that started from one of my premises. Both of us, writing's a very solitary art in a sense that, you're eventually people read your work, but for the longest time it's just you writing it. And it's not really a good idea to have some random person reading chapter by chapter with you, because that can really throw you off. That's why you beta read at the end and not the middle. But with our collaborative work, in a sense, it's kind of like having the audience with you, because I'll write my chapter and know that Armand's going to read it, and he'll write his and know that I'm about to read it. So it's almost like having the audience with you the whole way and more immediately. And we tend to kind of up our game for that reason, I think. Whereas you might, generally I just try to get a story out and then fix it on the back end. just get the story down. Don't hinder myself by trying to make every sentence perfect. But knowing that he's going to read the chapter, I think I put a little more into it on the first pass, and I think it ups both our games. Like, I got that first chapter that he wrote for Yard Full of Bones, and I was like, oh my God, I gotta take this more seriously, because he had done so well that I was like, oh, I can't just mail in a second chapter. Like, I gotta really step up on this.
Right.
And we felt the same way on Enemy Held Near. So I think in a sense where, you kind of have a temptation that in those first few chapters you'll kind of figure out where you're going, and then by chapter 4 you may have it, and a lot of times you end up cutting some of the early chapters because you realize the story started later. When we're writing together, I think we get that like, oh my God, he did so well. Like, I don't want my chapter to be the letdown. Right. And so we hit pretty strong, and that's where that went. It does have a strong mystery element, but I think we in some ways, I think we used the mystery to make the horror. And so that tension that comes with the mystery really got laced pretty thickly with what makes horror work too. And so it became a really strong book. And I remember reading back through it. You go back through and, like, especially with a book like that's very complex, you have to go back and make sure everything that was in there makes sense. Like, there wasn't some thread we started and forgot about or that kind of thing. And as I was reading back through, it kind of hit me again. You kind of expect to find it all messed up, but like how strong like his chapters were, and how hard I worked to kind of work up to him. And I think it's where that mystery element really worked in, was just his strength as a crime writer, and then us sort of kind of one-upping each other to try and keep that level of storytelling going.
I'm always fascinated with collaborations, especially collaborations on the scale that you guys do it. I've done some small project collaborations, but just the kind of the nuts and bolts of it. How do you guys handle the collaborative storytelling? Am I right that you guys are he writes one chapter, then you write a chapter? Are you guys just passing it back and forth like that?
Yeah, that's how we do it. It's not the only way to do it. I know. Sure. Some collaborators will do like first half a novel, second half a novel, which probably that style probably lends itself to people that don't share real well, I guess. And he's done a lot more collaborations with a lot more people, so he's kind of had to mold with different personalities. I think both of us kind of have a preference for each other because we have done so many books together. Part of it is that we both work on multiple things. So, like, when it's my turn to do a chapter, I'll take a break and kind of go ahead and do my chapter and send it back, and he'll do the same thing. And so these books don't get in the way of our other work. But then also, I think that we're both very generous in the sense that, he creates the characters, but he doesn't hold on to them tightly like, well, I wasn't expecting that, and that's not who that character is, kind of thing. And we'll edit each other as we go too. So we're not changing what somebody wrote, but we'll go back in and make an adjustment to something so that it makes sense to the story, that kind of thing. And neither of us get an ego about that. I think all collaborations live or die based on the personalities of the people. Like, if you can, it's great if both people are not selfish. At least one person has to be not selfish, but if it's only one person, that's probably not going to work well either. And so it's kind of that sense of like, all right, this is my chapter. I really don't care what you do. Whatever you do, that's the next chapter, and I'll figure out what the chapter after that is. And so we pass that story back and forth. We'll interchange characters and that kind of thing. And I think we do a good job of blending the voice to where, for example, like a lot of my horror will tend to have a lot more symbols, and I think maybe the best way to say it is I sometimes get a little more flowery when I'm writing, and Armand considers himself more of like a pulp type writer. And then again, I think we sort of blend somewhere in the middle to where we have sort of that strong third voice where, this doesn't have to sound like me, it has to sound like us. So that it's not like, pulp chapter, then purple chapter or whatever. It's sort of that this story has a voice, and it's the one we're creating together. So I think that's where our collaboration works well.
It kind of, the blending of the two of you kind of becomes a Robert E. Howard with a thesaurus kind of a writer.
Maybe.
I love it. So the book starts off as this kind of hard-boiled crime, kind of gritty crime mystery, and you guys really did a great job of setting that stage and really kind of putting me in that mood. When did you guys decide to go cosmic horror with the story? What is that conversation like? We've got this murder mystery. We've got this going on now. Let's take it to, super epic proportions. Where does that conversation come from?
Well, again, it sort of shapes itself. The seeds of it were kind of in the premise. So even in those first chapters, you kind of have this death that occurred at nobody's hand kind of thing. And so the way it was written, even though you could interpret it as we just didn't show you who the killer was, in a sense, there's something else going on, even in that very beginning. And, we kind of had the idea of, what the title was and what that meant and all that kind of stuff. And, that eventually it was going to this second location and that kind of thing. But it sort of shaped itself. We were, again, cosmic horror isn't necessarily my style. Naturally, he's written a little bit more of it than I have, but we just sort of let both the mystery and the horror sort of build itself up, and unraveling, who these people were and how they were connected, and a lot of that stuff came later too, and a lot of it was just discovered, in process. So each of us, as we were writing, were kind of figuring these things out as we went, and presenting new threads, and then figuring out how they went in, and then. Again, at the end, it's kind of my job to go back and make sure those things make sense. So there were, with a mystery, it's kind of hard to pants a mystery, because you kind of have to know, so we had basically done that. We had pantsed a mystery and at the same time of pantsing a horror story. And so going back, I had to make sure, okay, we hinted at this motivation. Does that work with what happened at the end? And if not, is there adjustments to dialogue, a couple things like that do make it work, to where it doesn't look like, we were writing one motivation and then it turned to another. Is it the same motivation all the way through? Does it make sense that he was hiding this secret? And a lot of it did work. We kind of, as we're writing, 17th, 18th, 19th chapter, taking turns, we kind of kept all that information in mind and kept it going. So, I don't know if you want to say it accidentally worked or it almost accidentally worked and then we fixed it, but it just sort of played itself in,
I wonder if you can totally pants a mystery, but what's usually going to happen is a second draft is going to go back and fix all those things and make sure when you put the gun on the mantle somewhere that you use it later, and that all the clues pay off, and or going back and planting clues that you didn't know were clues, until the end. The editing phase is usually a lot thicker on a pantsed mystery, because you didn't know what you were doing. But I wonder if the collaborative nature, where you guys are passing the story back and forth, maybe kept the story threads more fresh in your mind. Do you think that maybe just the collaborative nature helped it to stay informed better?
Well, I think, and then at the same time, like all the books that we've done together, we could not have done as well alone. Like there's just stuff that both of us bring to the table that wouldn't be available to the other. And so I always feel like some of these novels are the strongest that I've ever written with him, and I know he feels the same way about them. And I think a lot of it is that we have a deeper well of resources. But then, in terms of a mystery of working this way, when we weren't expecting that we were necessarily writing that, is that it was a mystery to both of us. So, whereas, you're kind of making it up as you go as one person, that can get really flat. But with the two of us, the stuff that each of us was introducing into the story was something the other didn't expect. So when I read back through it, I find it to be surprising in the sense that, like, it doesn't feel like it goes in this linear path that I would expect, So I think it works as a mystery because we kind of, in a way, we were holding secrets from each other without realizing it. Where these stories could change, and explaining what had happened to a particular town later, and some things like that I think really worked in the end, because we were both discovering it as we went, same as the reader was.
How do you guys share this document back and forth? Are you just creating a Word document, emailing it back and forth? Are you using Google Docs? Kind of, what are some of the logistics that you run into with a project like this?
When he and I write together, we do the drafting with Google Docs. Now, he writes directly in Google Docs. I typically will write a chapter in a Word document and, edit myself, and then cut and paste my chapter in to that document. And then at the end, once we get towards the end, we're kind of figuring out, okay, somebody's going to write this last chapter. And so we sort of like, when we know there's a last chapter, one of us will just go ahead and write the ending. It may turn out to be 2 or 3 chapters, but basically someone's tasked with, okay, we're at the end, who's going to end this? And then I'll cut and paste that entire Google Doc into a Word doc and do the edit, where I go through and, of course, fix the typos and stuff, but then also do continuity, where I've kept track of the Bible of the story, making sure that all that stuff still makes sense, making adjustments so that it fits right. And then typically I'll pass that Word doc on to him at the end, and we'll get it professionally edited once we've both gone through it, that kind of thing. And then that's when we start shopping it to publishers and that sort of thing.
Nice. Well, the book is called Yard Full of Bones. It's one of the best mysteries that I've read in quite a while. That takes a lot of turns that I didn't expect, and just becomes one of the best thriller horror books. At the same time. I highly recommend this book. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Jay, if people are just learning about you and your work, where can they find you online, dig into your back catalog, follow along with news and all of that good stuff?
Of course, everybody's on Amazon. You can go to jwilburn.com, and under books, you have my series and other things that are on there. I'm also going to be starting putting some stories and books directly on there, where I only sell them from my website instead of Amazon too. The stuff that Armand and I have done together, of course, you got Yard Full of Bones, but then you can also check out The Enemy Held Near, which is a haunted house story that we wrote together. And then we have a couple other books that we're shopping around that may be out in the near future as well.
Excellent. I'll link it all up in the show notes, and we'll put links to Armand's website and his network of 480 podcasts that he helms as well. Do you have a podcast on the network?
Yeah, I do the Matters of Faith podcast.
That's right. I knew I'd seen that before. Yeah. Give us a plug for your podcast. What's it about?
Basically, I just kind of let people tell their own stories, and faith in many cases is traditional religions. I'm Christian, and a lot of the guests are Christian as well. But I've had people on that follow Mahai Baba, and I've had people on that really don't fall into a traditional religious sense, but deal with spirituality and that kind of thing. And also faith can mean leaps of faith, like in a secular sense of how you kind of keep going against the odds, and when you're dealing with health issues or any of that other kind of stuff. So it's just basically people telling their stories of how they overcome and what kind of gets them through.
Excellent. I just subscribed on my phone right now. I love that idea. I'm gonna get into it. That sounds fascinating. Jay, thank you for coming on the show, and we'll link up Armand's stuff. He dropped out a little bit ago. They had a power outage. He's in Florida, and they've got some gnarly weather coming in today. So just praying that they're okay there.
Yeah.
But I think he's
hopefully he doesn't get
away.
washed away in the middle of the podcast.
Then. It would be something for us to talk about. But
right. I mean, if he has to go, at least it's on a podcast where we can get some ratings up, which I think he'd appreciate.
Exactly. We're just like Anderson Cooper, just kneeling in the water for ratings. That's us. Yeah. Jay, thanks so much for coming on the show, buddy. We're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of Yard Full of Bones. And, thanks for coming on.
All right. Thank you for having us, Guy.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. No way. Ain't gonna happen. But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.